Thank you. Sir, I am Tanvirul Miraj Ripon, privileged and excited to join by a unique guest, a prominent voice, Professor Emeritus from MIT, writer, philosopher, historian, a dissident voice, Professor Noam Chomsky. He pens more than 100 books. Professor Noam Chomsky, thanks for joining me on Teacup again.
Very pleased to be with you.
My first question, I'm sure many people love you and they want to know how are you in this pandemic and how is your family? You know, I read Abiba Chomsky's book. She is a historian and your daughter. How is she?
We're all managing, fortunately, very well. We've managed to escape any of the signs of it, children, grandchildren. So we're lucky so far. But we're fine.
Great. Considering the economic situation of the G7 countries from the perspective of the COVID-19 pandemic, in the next 10 years, which country is going to lead the political economy in Central and Southeast Asia?
Countries have differed. The countries of Asia and Oceania, New Zealand, Australia, and all the Asian countries, China, South Korea, Taiwan, they've done pretty well. They dealt with Japan, they've dealt with the problem expeditiously, managed to control the pandemic, return to some kind of normalcy. Europe is a mixed story. The United States has not done very well. It's the highest, not per capita, but the highest absolute number of deaths, far beyond what should be. Unfortunately, there's a substantial anti-vaccination movement, which means that the hospitals are filled to overflowing with unvaccinated patients, causing enormous crush on the entire health system. To a lesser extent, this is true in some of the European countries. The real crisis is the failure to vaccinate billions of people in the global south. First of all, that's criminal in itself, but it's also creating a pool of unvaccinated people where the virus can mutate, take new forms, maybe more deadly forms, come back and strike against the whole world. This is because the Western countries, in this case, primarily the European countries, have insisted on maintaining the rights of the pharmaceutical corporations to process. They're not allowing other states to use the processes to make the very effective vaccines.
Professor Chomsky, quad countries, all are democracies and vibrant economies, work on a far broader agenda, including tackling security, economics, and health issues. So, what are your thoughts about the Quad? Do you have any specific?
There are different dimensions. So, in terms of, you take a look at the pandemic, the country that looks far and away the most successful in handling it is China. A few thousand deaths. The United States has approaching 1 million deaths. There is a problem there, which has been pointed out by epidemiologists. The zero COVID project in China does mean that the level of immunity will not be high, which means that the population might be susceptible to wave of infections that it's not prepared for. We don't know this. So far, their outcomes there are very good, but there's a danger lurking.
My another question is, how will ASEAN deal with the AUKUS Pact and its impact?
Well, I think that's very dangerous. The
Why?
AUKUS says the recent act that first of all, the Australian government is extremely reactionary. It's moving into very dangerous territory. As you know, the United States has just broken a contract that Australia had with France to provide submarines, and instead the United States and Britain will be providing a fleet of advanced nuclear submarines to Australia. There's no strategic purpose for this. They won't even be in operation for about 15 years. At that point, China will surely have developed, expanded its naval deterrent systems so as to be able to counter this radical new threat to China. So it's a provocation. It's a terrible provocation. It's in waters that are of strategic significance to China. It's their major trade area. The idea of provoking conflict needlessly is hazardous, pointless, and extremely threatening and dangerous policy. And in general, there are problems that have to be dealt with. China's behavior also is blameworthy. They have violated international decisions, legal decisions on fortifying islands in the South China Sea. But these are all issues that can be handled by diplomacy and negotiations. The idea of raising the level of tension and provocation is crazy.
So, will Europe take America's side to counter Chinese dominance in the world economy?
China's moving to expand its influence and power, and it could, in the long run, become dominant in the world economy, but that's a long distance away. The wealthy countries, which if you look at by the size of the economy, China pretty much compares with the United States. But if you look at per capita wealth, it's way below the United States. And China has serious internal problems that the Western countries don't have. Ecological, security problems, and so on. On the other hand, what China's doing is very extensive. The Belt and Road Initiative is essentially integrating Central Asia into a Chinese-dominated system. It's within the framework of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, includes Russia, India, Pakistan, Central Asian states, Iran, moving towards Turkey, might move towards Central Europe, all a massive investment development program, integrating this within a Chinese system. And there's development and investment and loans in Africa, Southeast Asia, to a limited extent, Latin America. This is a very extensive system. The United States has tried to block Chinese development by pressuring countries not to use Chinese technology. Australia, for example, has even gotten to the point where they're refusing to allow Huawei sensors on equipment. But China's getting around this they just recently established about 1,000 schools, technical schools in Southeast Asia and Africa, where students will be trained in Chinese technology, and that's the technology they'll use. The United States is trying to counter this, but you can't counter it with force. That's, first of all, it's improper way to proceed, and secondly, it's self-defeating.
So, can India provide the US with strategic laboratories in the Indo-Pacific region?
India is a very close US ally now, mainly because the Modi government is basically dismantling Indian democracy, turning India into an ethnocracy, a Hindu ethnocracy. Now that fits with the general international reactionary alliance that the United States has been constructing very strongly under the Trump years, still to an extent. But India has enormous problems. It's the gap between extreme wealth and miserable poverty is enormous in India. Much of India is just still barely been developed. There are economic problems, there are political problems, and beyond that, there are severe ecological problems. South Asia altogether is facing a very difficult future if current trends persist and strong actions are not taken to deal with the climate crisis. A large part of South Asia may become literally unlivable in the not very distant future.
How will the West make China accountable for the human rights violations?
There's not very much that other countries can do to make China accountable for human rights violations. Similarly, there's not much that China can do to deal with human rights violations in India. And there's not much that other countries can do to deal with the human rights violations carried out by the United States in its support for the Saudi attack on Yemen, the worst humanitarian crisis in the world, withholding funds from Afghanistan, where much of the population is facing literal starvation, supporting Israel's vicious attacks on millions of people in Gaza. Nothing much that the world can do about this. Each country it's up to the citizens of each country to compel their governments to put an end to human rights violations. It would be nice to be able to wave a magic wand and have an effect, but it's very hard to do. You can make gestures, but not much that's very effective.
What do you think the West should do to hold Myanmar to account?
Same problem. Be nice to be able to wave a magic wand, but there isn't a great deal that can be done. You can protest, you impose sanctions on individuals, none of it makes much difference. There's very little that it would be nice if it were different, but in fact, no one has serious proposals to how to deal with severe human rights violations elsewhere. What we can do is deal with severe human rights violations within the reach of our power. Each country can do that. So India can deal with severe human rights violations in India. Can't do much about severe human rights violations in China, and conversely. It's very interesting that we spend a great deal of time and effort thinking about how to deal with other people's human rights violations, meanwhile ignoring our own, not doing anything about our own, the ones that we can affect. There's a very simple moral principle. You should focus your efforts where you can do most good. Okay? If there are human rights violations on Mars, I can't do much about them. If they're here, right in front of me, I can. And that should be the guiding principle. Unfortunately, we tend to take the opposite principle, to focus on the ones we can't do much about, because they're carried out by hostile or enemy states, and ignore the ones that we can do a lot about. So, for example, there's great concern, as there should be, about 1 million Uyghurs who were sent to re-education camps, suffered very harsh and brutal treatment. We should express our concern about that and think about if there are any ways we can do something about it. Meanwhile, at the very same time, 1 million children in Gaza are literally do not even have water to drink because of the harsh and brutal US-backed Israeli attacks that have placed 2 million people in the world's largest open-air prison camp. We can do a lot about that, so therefore we don't talk about it. What we talk about is something that somebody else is doing that we can't do much about. And this is quite general.
Professor Noam Chomsky, what are your thoughts on the ethnic cleansing against the Rohingya and big claims that they suffered genocide?
Genocide?
Yeah.
I don't genocide.
Why?
Because it has been so vulgarized and politicized that it has become meaningless. It's become an insult to the victims of true genocide, like in the Holocaust. The term genocide is thrown around freely for any atrocity by people we don't like. That's a disgraceful behavior. I'm not going to participate in it. So I don't use the term genocide for massive atrocities that the US backs or for major atrocities that other backs. Once the term has been vulgarized and politicized, it's basically lost its utility. So if you want to really talk about approaching genocide, probably the closest case to literal genocide in the post-Second World War period is the invasion of the Indonesian invasion of East Timor. About a third of the population. That's you don't talk about that because we were responsible for it, and we could have ended it at any point. So therefore, we don't discuss it. I don't call it genocide. I do say that it's virtual. It's as close to genocide as occurred. But I'm not going to use the term just as a means of attacking somebody else when we don't use it for ourselves.
Sir, I have just last question. I'm a young one. So do you have any specific for the young generation to lead the world? Do you have any specific recommendation or advice for the youth who will lead the world?
Any recommendation?
Yes.
For what people?
For the young generation, for the youth, for the newcomers.
The young generation, people of your generation.
Like me.
Are facing challenges that have never arisen in human history. Never. We are on a course right now towards self-destruction. There are several, as you may know, the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists every year sets the hands of what's called the doomsday clock a certain distance from midnight. It's an analysis of the global security situation. They've abandoned minutes. It used to be minutes. Now it's seconds. Just a week ago, they made the latest setting 100 seconds to midnight. Terminal disaster for the human species. And they gave the usual reasons: the growing threat of nuclear war, the failure to deal with the impending environmental crisis, and the destruction of an arena of rational debate and discussion. Those three things, they say, are sufficient to set the hands of the clock 100 seconds from midnight. That's your challenge. That's never been true in human history before, that the species was facing a challenge like this. And the only I can deplore the fact that my generation didn't deal with it. In fact, made it worse. Brought about a situation where your generation is going to have to pick up the pieces and try to repair some of the damage and move on towards a much better world. It's possible, but the time span of doing it is narrowing. We don't have much time, so it has to be done quickly, expeditiously, decisively. That's the challenge that your generation faces.
Please, sir, stay safe, and we need you. We need you. Please stay safe, and this is really great. Thank you, sir. Thank you.